So thank you everyone for attending today. And if you were here last week, it's good to have you back. And if it's your first here, we welcome you. We had a great conversation last week, taking a look at kind of the first part of Chris's book, Taking Juvenile Justice Seriously. And today we're going to kind of dive into the second part of his book, which really kind of focuses on how we can start to think about a developmentally informed juvenile justice system. So without taking up too much time here, I'm going to turn things over to Chris.
Sure. Thanks, Derek. Can you hear me okay? All right, great. All right. So thanks everyone for being here for the second week, the second session of this series of 3. As Derek mentioned today, I'll probably focus a bit, or will focus a bit more on some of the back parts of the book that have a bit more to do with operationalizing some of this work, some of this developmental research, life course research in the juvenile justice system. Last week, for those who were in attendance, kind of cut short before getting into too much of the the heart of some of the developmental science, or at least some of the developmental science that's a little bit more related to crime and delinquency. So I'm going to start today with a few points on that, and then we'll move quickly into some other points on evidence-based juvenile justice from the standpoint of developmental science. I will say that the chapter 5 in the book covers that pretty extensively, and so if there are questions about that, I'm happy to answer them. Certainly at the appropriate time. So I'm going to move to share my screen at the moment. Make sure that I get the right. Right, and so building on where we were last week. Again, I'll cover a few points just to kind of give you a little bit of feel for some of the things that I feel are important in thinking about developmental juvenile justice. And I would argue that to some extent, these are points that in some of the existing discussions maybe aren't quite front and center. And I think they do have some implications for the juvenile justice system. You can see here the first point, we'll just kind of talk about that. We'll talk about evidence-informed juvenile justice in question 3. Point 3, I missed here, I guess, when I updated these this morning. But then we'll talk about implementation and have a little bit of material on that, and then set up week 3 as well. And I think that will be a bit more on how this works or doesn't work, the challenges in the juvenile justice system. With respect to a lot of the points that are made in the book, and very much looking forward to that. So we'll talk about that at the end. So developmental and life course criminology and thinking about juvenile delinquency, there's a few things that we have that come into play that I think are helpful. One is that it gives us a language and some concepts that help to explain behavior over time. Certainly they're not absolute. Certainly there's a lot of variability in the cases that come before the juvenile court, but we definitely can think about things in the explanation of behavior over time. And I do think that that's important as a way of framing juvenile justice policy and practice, just because we know that there's kind of a pathway to the system for a given youth, and then there's pathways from the system. And so kind of at each stage, there's factors that are coming into play as the youth sort of interacts with their social influences, as they interact with the system itself, as the system responds to their behavior too. And I think that that's really important if we think about that from a longitudinal perspective. And that's really one of the key things I think that a developmental and life course view can bring. We can think about risk and protective factors, but then also sort of the theoretical perspectives that build on those. So how do we actually link risk factors to aspects of delinquency? What does it look like to kind of explain and understand the mechanisms underlying potential responses? And so again, we'll highlight some of the points that I didn't get to last week, and then we'll move into some of the discussion of evidence-based practice in juvenile justice. And I tend to like Bronfenbrenner's framework, developmental framework, as a way of thinking about how the juvenile justice system and youth are intertwined. He was sort of talking about this system a bit more generally, but basically, thinking about the youth in the center of the system, and then thinking about social influences that are more proximal, such as family or peers. Then there's systems that are a bit more community-based, like school. Juvenile justice, we could kind of talk about whether that belongs in the third layer or the fourth layer. But then there's also culture and society and norms and laws as well. And all of those kind of come together. And what happens is that this sort of gives us some sense of this complex developmental kind of phenomena that's happening with delinquency, and helps us to essentially understand that the youth, as they're sort of going through and experiencing these, they're behaving and then also experiencing influences on that behavior. It's sort of done interactively over time. Okay? And I think one of the things that's really important for us to think about is the fact that the juvenile justice system is going to be one of those influences. And with that, it really is important that as we think about how we carry out juvenile justice, the juvenile justice policy, that we're really mindful of the fact that there's kind of a pattern, a developmental pattern that's going to lead youth to the system. And then again, like I said before, there's going to be a pattern that kind of follows them from the system as well. And so being thoughtful about that, I think, is one first step that's really important in thinking about developmental juvenile justice. And so another framework that I kind of like, which is, thinking about the diversity in process and outcome. And so, we all sort of have these examples in mind of youth that we may have thought were or assessed as high risk, but then end up doing fine, and then vice versa. Youth maybe who, if we looked at them at one point in time, they were, doing fine, but then ultimately wind up kind of in the deeper end of the juvenile justice system. And so this is kind of where we get into the idea of diversity in process and outcome. And I think the way that this helps sensitize us in thinking about juvenile justice is, if we have youth as these sort of open systems that are kind of growing and changing, there's multiple pathways that can generate the same outcome. So as we know, there are multiple ways in which a youth might wind up in the system. And then there's also the fact that the same initial condition, so if we think about we're observing a youth from the time that they're referred to the juvenile court, there's a number of different pathways that they can take from that place, from that point in time, and from whatever risk needs, strengths are present in their lives at that point. And it's sort of I think it's important to recognize that variability, but also be mindful of the fact that if we're looking closely and sort of understanding things from that perspective, we may be able to identify patterns and regularities in those pathways. And we may be able to understand, okay, when we take this step with a low risk youth, kind of here's what the trend tends to be like. Or if we take, this step, then we may be more or less successful. And some of that is inherent in the research that we have now. But by the same token, we don't necessarily have a framework that moves beyond maybe not wanting them to recidivate, and thinks a little bit more about developmental pathways out of the system. And so there's also the this life course theory, where we have some frameworks over time. That this goes back, interestingly, to some work on the Great Depression and how different individuals, even within the same family, responded to those events. And so Glenn Elder goes back to these cohort studies that were almost 100 years ago now in terms of when they were completed. But basically the idea was to think about how different factors influence the life course of individuals. And I think the idea that individuals do make decisions, but not in a vacuum. And so there's contingencies and constraints. And then also this idea of linked lives, meaning, and I think everyone probably on the call could point out situations either in their own lives or in working with youth where someone's parent really seems to affect their ability to potentially make it through probation supervision successfully, maybe, or their ability to really concentrate in school is really affected a lot by family situations, and that has implications for not only what happens in the school environment, but then also juvenile justice referral too. And so again, when we look at this issue of timing and lives, linked lives, human agency, and historical time and place, essentially what all they're saying is that there is some room for agency in terms of how lives proceed, but a lot of times these other factors, historical time and place, timing and lives, and then linked lives are actually having an influence as well, even if sometimes it's implicit. And so one of the last points, and this is fairly something that's going to be common, especially when we think about assessment, is that there's a great deal of research on risk factors for delinquent behavior. I won't go into all of it this afternoon, but essentially the idea is that when that is present, there could be an increased likelihood of delinquency, and that can be found in a variety of different domains. I think one of the things that developmental insights should give us is this idea that among these different areas, individual, family, peers, school, community, there can be interaction. And so a lot of times when we're simply adding up different indicators, we might miss that interaction and the degree to which those complex contingencies between, for example, a youth who may have had trouble in school but has good support at home may have a slightly different risk profile than one that is affected in both areas, if you will. So thinking about this, we need to consider developmentally a bit more about how these interact. And of course, there's always going to be protective factors or strengths as well that we need to be mindful of. And so when we're thinking about developmental juvenile justice, what are we talking about? At least in terms of some of the things that I think are important. We're moving past a static view of delinquency and better understand what happened before and what happens next. So oftentimes we might know a youth's delinquency history when they come before the court or when they're interacting with a correctional agency. But the degree to which that kind of narrative is elaborated to the point where we can understand kind of where they're at that particular point may not be that detailed. And this allows us to have more thorough characterization of delinquency patterns and then also how those risk factors fit together. So I think if we consider the way that we assess, and I'll talk about this in a minute, one of the points that we often need to think about is not just the information that we have there, but then also kind of how we're looking at it, how we're analyzing. Are we thinking about it as simply this additive kind of set of factors or indicators, or are we thinking a little bit more as a kind of a narrative that we can potentially piece together to understand what types of patterns might emerge? And I think this also gets us a bit beyond simply counting up factors and assigning a level of risk, although that may be necessary certainly for programming and for some level of classification. It's also maybe incomplete from the standpoint of the narrative that it gives us with which to respond. And so this is this last point here, which I think is a quote that I identified as I was doing the research for the book, and basically from Kramer and colleagues in 2001. And she and her colleagues basically said, accumulating risk factors and either counting or scoring them does little to increase the understanding of the etiological processes or of how interventions might be optimally timed, constructed, or delivered. So, while on the one hand, we can maybe sort youth with some of the kind of more static approaches or fixed point approaches that we have, I think we need to, if we're thinking developmentally, that's going to help us a bit more in terms of how we would place and situate the intervention in the youth's life, thinking about kind of the pathway there and the obstacles maybe that might occur with that intervention, then also how they're going to respond to that intervention. So this is just an overview of juvenile justice processing. And, this is something that I think is, we may have all seen it before. It gets put out every couple of years. And I like it for a lot of reasons. I think, in this context, what it shows really is that there's a lot of different pathways and permutations in juvenile justice. So, we think about youth that are petitioned, and we see that that's about 57% of the cases in 2018 that were included in this data set. And then you can see that within that, there's a few different pathways that youth can go. They can be adjudicated and then placed. They can be referred to probation. They can have some other sanction. They can be not adjudicated and then have probation or another sanction. And so there's a variety of different permutations of how juvenile justice gets done. And with that, the different decisions that happen, we can either have those be developmentally informed and then also developmentally impactful. So I think we want to be thinking about, okay, how could we, for example, use some of our insights about a youth's development to make some determination about, what the best, if we're thinking about this percent other sanction, for example, versus probation, what might be effective, what might be useful for a particular type of youth, given their kind of their developmental pattern, developmental history, that could be useful there. And I think the other point is, depending on kind of how this plays out and how they proceed through the system, there's going to be different developmental impacts. Obviously, the developmental impact for youth who's placed in a residential facility could be quite different from the youth who's placed on probation. Again, kind of controlling for other factors. So if we think about developmental assessment and juvenile justice, I think that we can definitely think about, or we definitely need to be mindful of how assessment works and how that helps to identify the factors on which we can promote change. And as I've said before, I think that we need to consider how particular influences shaped youth's trajectory of interaction, and how they arrived at the system, for example. And so, one of the examples, one example that I sometimes give is that, you could have a score of 1 on a particular risk item, let's say a family or maybe a peer-based item, but the way that manifests could be quite different across individuals. It could differ, depending on, they could have peers that are engaged in delinquency, but be, somewhat resilient to that influence. And, the youth has actually engaged in the delinquent act for which they're before the court, individually, or it's in the family home that it's occurred. So I think we need to think about not just the risk factors, but also sort of how they manifest as these mechanisms and indicators, and how they inform the narrative about a youth's behavior, and then also the best response. And so assessment is intended to inform juvenile justice dispositions. And so, what we need to do is to help characterize the variation that was described earlier, or that would be last week. It needs to occur both earlier and later in the process of the juvenile justice system. Implementation is really important. And I think, one of the ideas is that we need to enhance, needs enhancement for developmental juvenile justice, but it can inform effective treatment and sanctions, especially when it's updated over time. I think we carried out a relatively recent study looking at the implementation of juvenile risk and needs assessment tools. And one of the things that really came up quite a bit was the strategies and the policies on reassessment were a bit variable. The degree to which reassessment was occurring over time was fairly scattered across states and then also within states. And so ultimately what this leads to is not only we're not necessarily getting as much information, especially if we want to engage in some of the developmental strategies that we've been talking about, but then the other issue potentially is that you have kind of an initial label that a youth is sort of has on a risk assessment, and there's really not an opportunity maybe to change that too much, at least in a front and center explicit way. So we really need, if we're thinking about developmental juvenile justice, that idea of assessment and reassessment is really important. And then, I think some of the ideas of the effective intervention, and then developmental juvenile justice. So a few fundamental points that we need to kind of move into is one, there's a lot of variation in the juvenile justice population and then possible responses. And so we saw that in that flow chart. There's a lot of different responses. And then if we think about, other sanctions or other interventions, it runs the gamut in terms of what could be implemented. And we saw a lot of those last week when I posted the second poll question, where the real question was like, what are some developmental strategies maybe that we could use? And it really kind of stretched from more gender responsive programming to different types of intensive, MST type interventions, young adult courts. And so there's a whole host of different, and teen courts, there's a whole host of different interventions we could use. And that kind of creates a lot of kind of loose coupling of the system. And so some of the ideas behind delinquency careers and understanding delinquency patterns over time can help to guide potential responses. And I think the other thing that's really important is this last point, which is that this can help, that having this insight can help to consider other factors that are underlying youth behavior. So, what is it about the youth individually? What environment and social influences? How is the youth interacting with those settings and institutions? And I think the last point, which is really important, to expand the goals of treatment to other developmental outcomes. Obviously the system, the juvenile justice system, is going to have a front and center emphasis on particular outcomes. But in order to be a bit more developmental in its nature, it also may need to be gathering information and following up on other things that are going on in the youth's life in order to kind of more holistically look at success in intervention. So this is basically some, if we're thinking about developmental intervention, I think this is a good place to start in terms of the Catalano and Hawkins overview. And they basically lay out 5 different principles. First is that each process driving delinquency could be a point for intervention. And so, again, if that's an issue where maybe there's a family interaction that really seems to be driving that pattern and that trajectory, or perhaps it's the youth's interaction with school that's really driving a lot of their delinquent or peer delinquency, or peers, of course. I think the other notion that they lay down is a second one, that there's a multi-causal nature of these risk and protective factors. And that means that there's going to be different treatment and intervention programs that are necessary. I think the third point, treatment should attempt to interrupt mechanisms contributing to delinquency and then bolster pro-social development. And so, I think the idea of imparting skills along the way is really important as well, and being really intentional about that as far as how youth are going to be responded to in the juvenile justice system. I think the idea of intervening as early as possible with developmentally appropriate treatment is another point that's really important from the stance of developmental intervention. And then I think this other point here, this points of transition, are good places to potentially intervene. I think looking for places where intervention can potentially be optimized and targeted is really important. So when Catalano and Hawkins are talking about this, they're really talking about it from the perspective more of school-based intervention. But I've been in a court hearing where a judge, basically pointed out that, a youth who is moving from 8th grade into high school at a particular point in the judge's conversation with the youth as they were sort of laying out what the expectations would be for their supervision, pointed out the notion of this transition as a place for maybe a turning point, if you will. And turning points are going to be a key aspect, a key element. We're thinking about development and the life course. And so identifying and supporting those types of turning points, whether through formal intervention or even through bolstering natural supports, and maybe reinforcing maybe to a parent that that's an important place to concentrate as a youth moves across those settings and identify some space for change, could be a manifestation of this points of transition argument. In terms of other factors that we need to consider, and this goes right along with that, is that if we're thinking about risk and reward, we have to consider in our intervention the mechanisms that promote desistance more naturally. So sometimes changes in decision-making contingencies, changes in perceived choice and agency, increased opportunity for pro-social interactions, and then aging in the developmental process. And so all of these points are kind of things that occur naturally. They occur over time. And so what they are is a reminder that to some extent, if we're thinking developmentally and we go back to our notion of the age crime curve, there's going to be some desistance that happens just naturally. And one of the things developmentally that we know in some ways is that to some extent, if we think about adolescent choices and we think about the social space of adolescence, especially if there's some risk-taking behavior that's going to be somewhat normative in that time, well, in some sense, the decisions that we see can actually be optimized to that time and space for particular youth, even though obviously they are delinquent acts in certain cases and then status offenses in others. But from the youth's perspective, they may be optimized to their social environment in terms of demonstrating loyalty or garnering some other social reward in terms of feelings of esteem or popularity or enhancing a linkage between them and a peer. And so we need to keep in mind that to some extent, as we intervene, there's a push against that sort of natural kind of environment and state that changes gradually as youth will grow up. And so that's one thing in terms of kind of the baseline of intervening that's really important, is thinking about the risk and reward structure in adolescence and what that means as far as contextualizing the interventions that we engage in. And I think the idea of some of this is that there is going to be there is a premium on maybe responding in a way that's right-sized, that's not too harsh, and we sort of know that just from the standpoint of the idea of a least restrictive alternative as a framework for placement for juveniles. Some other things that are really important in terms of just considering the developmental influence from informal sort of sources is that we want to be thinking about treatment from the standpoint of the interaction between youth and their environment. And so there's going to be both obstacles and opportunities from institutions, and we need to be mindful of those. So again, if there's something that's going to potentially be an influence that could work against intervention, we need to be mindful of that and identify ways maybe to bolster developmental skills in order to handle that. So we think maybe about youth who are in environments where there is a lot of delinquency, perhaps in their school, and bolstering and trying to understand peer refusal skills, for example. And I think that this gets into needing to consider the attitudes and thinking patterns from an individual standpoint, but really also how those are really strongly intertwined with developmental status and social environment. And so this refers back to that point of, to some extent, there's going to be patterns of thinking in adolescence that are somewhat different than what we would expect to see as youth and adolescents develop further. And there's going to be emphasis from the social environment that also might dissipate over time too. I think the idea of developmental juvenile justice also, I mentioned this earlier, it's really important to be thinking in a sort of growth type framework here, and in some ways at least an asset-centered framework if we're considering developmental and life course framing of juvenile justice. So, I think overall what we've seen is that while there is some move to kind of positive youth development frames and strength-based approaches to assessment and to intervention, there's still a heavy use of a risk-centered framework in juvenile justice. And to some extent, again, that's inevitable based on some of the missions of the juvenile justice system. But there's been some shift to acknowledge potential strengths, but it's really important to have balance in terms of thinking about a developmental juvenile justice, because it's important to kind of think about ways to promote change by essentially enhancing existing skills, by recognizing those, by being mindful that this isn't necessarily a fixed state. So again, one of the ideas of using a longitudinal framework for understanding delinquency is, again, it's this inherent point or this inherent sort of understanding that it's not a fixed state and it's something that will evolve and potentially change over time, of course. And so this really gives some framework in terms of what developmental juvenile justice would sort of view, how it would view and kind of look at growth and change from the perspective of working with youth. And then some ideas about developmentally informed juvenile justice sanctions. And I think that the first thing is that effective juvenile justice sanctions can be linked to development. Zimmering, again, I mentioned this last week, is the idea of sort of some gradual freedom to make decisions and experience the effect of those without crippling youth's long-term prospects. Obviously, we think about sanctions and being developmentally informed. Want to avoid those severe sanctions that really have really outsized impacts to whatever extent possible. And so again, I mentioned that idea of the least restrictive alternative. I know that recently there's been some reports on Utah's reforms that have led to declines in state residential placements. And so that's, I think, work that's been happening, obviously there in Utah and then in other states across the country in recent years. And I think that that's really important in terms of having the space really to work developmentally, because if there is a lot of use and maybe use to the extent that you're sweeping some youth in to those severe sanctions that maybe don't need to be there, well, that makes it really difficult to actually get into a developmental framework for juvenile justice. And I think the idea too that's really important when we talk about the nature of the juvenile justice system is that we can complement effective treatment with some developmentally informed sanctions. And so, I think that there's a few priorities if we're doing that. If we're going to use those developmentally informed sanctions, prioritize a few objectives. They express disapproval appropriately, so it's very clear what the offense is and how the sanction is tied to that. Give the youth sense of moral ownership of the behavior and the harm of it, and that hopefully will foster agency. So, give them the sense that they can self-determine. I just mentioned avoid overly harsh punishment, and then also make it age appropriate. So this would be graded to age as well. And I think, the idea is that being comprehensive but measured in the response is really important, and being mindful of the development of moral identity. And so this comes into this idea of fostering this moral ownership so that youth are understanding that there's harm that's been caused by the behavior, and then that they have some control over that. And they also have control over how perhaps to respond to it in an appropriate way in terms of making it right, and then also how to avoid it in the future. And again, the idea here is that we can't look at the juvenile justice system as a separate thing from other social influences and institutions. And so ideally we can have some collective agreement on the response and ensure that it's very clear. As we know, probation is quite a common response to delinquency cases. And we saw basically in that flow chart again, that the percentage of youth that wind up on probation, either sort of informally or formally, is really quite high relative to other potential options in the juvenile justice process. And so with that, probation is a really common response to delinquency. And so if we're really endeavoring to make the system more developmental, we need to think about probation in terms of how that works developmentally. And so that dyadic relationship really can serve as an important developmental leverage point. And so if we go back to that Bronfenbrenner visual where you sort of has the youth at the center of the process, well, the probation officer then comes into play at one of those second or third layers. And that interaction between them, between the youth and the probation officer really becomes important in terms of as a developmental leverage point for the youth. And so, again, this is really, the probation officer is really central and essential in the developmental juvenile justice process. They are going to be balancing treatment and sanction, ensuring that youths understand court orders. I think that that's really important as well, is that developmental kind of growth over time. And again, trying to impart some agency to the youth. They should really have a sense of what the reasoning was for the particular sanction or the particular intervention or treatment that they're involved with. And I think it really is important to think about every interaction between youth and probation officer in terms of the impact, both impacting the youth's performance on supervision, and then also in terms of the impacts on their later development. And so, the idea to have that agency for youth, have realistic expectations, and then have access to appropriate treatment resources, then that can be useful in sort of that development of a moral identity and that individuation, and then also a turn from to a more pro-social trajectory. And so the idea, and I think that it's laid out kind of nicely by Maloney et al. In a paper that's fairly old now, but basically lays out the idea of fostering accountability and supporting competency development. But I think that that framework and that foundation can be quite useful just in thinking about the balance between, okay, there's a juvenile justice system mission here, and then there's also a general youth development objective as well that's happening at the same time. And that's really important in this probation officer youth interaction. And then procedural justice in terms of juvenile justice contacts and sanctions. I think one of the things that can happen, and this was actually raised in a conversation with some of the Utah stakeholders before we did this three-part session, and I think we'll come back to it next week. But the idea of the individualized nature of the juvenile justice process can sometimes have an impact if a youth is talking to their friend or they're on the same, they're basically involved in the same case, but ultimately get different sanctions. There's kind of a risk of eroding some of the perceived legitimacy and people wondering, or youth and families wondering a bit about that idea of equality versus equity in terms of how sanctions occur and treatment and so forth. And so one of the things is that it's really important to convey the reasoning for outcomes and processes well with youth, and so and their families as well, to support that as well. And so I think that this parallels some research on youth internalization from parental discipline. And so there's some useful, if we think about development and how parents parent, there's some useful insight there just in terms of connecting the specific transgression to the sanction in a clear way. What was the reasoning for a particular response? What's the expectation going forward? And so from a developmental standpoint, connecting that to procedural justice in terms of youth contact and sanctions, that can be quite important. And this is also why it's important as well when we start to think about police interaction with youth, is that if that sort of sets the tone for the process, and I know there are an awful lot of programs now that are attempting to train police a bit more in understanding youth development and adolescence and even adolescence brain science. But the idea of making sure that first contact all the way through disposition and treatment and intervention that there's some clarity in the process is really important from a developmental standpoint. And so this is a chart from the group from the book, and really just kind of thinking developmentally and considering some goals that we might have here. And what we have here is basically a scenario where first there's a few things going on here. One is that if we're thinking about individual risk, ideally, this is going down over time based on intervention and based on development, but we want to be following it. We want to be aware of places where these crossovers come. And so we do need to be mindful of following over time if we can, as much as possible. Realize that's time consuming and sometimes costly, but ultimately with developmental juvenile justice, there may be at least to try to pilot some of that, I think can be useful for systems. And then we can see here in terms of official court contact and delinquency, the one thing that can be apparent is that sometimes there's increasing delinquency over time, and then at the same time there's no court contact or continued delinquency. And so being able to kind of get a bit clearer sense of what's going on from multiple perspectives can be useful as far as a developmental insight. And so what we would want to do is be following up at different points and really try to understand how are all of these patterns related to one another. Obviously, we could also get some insight into other aspects of the youth's life that might be important in terms of driving these trends too. I think, here basically what we're saying is that secure placement is going to be, there's developmental challenges in secure placement. And so it's really important to think about that space as somewhere that while not optimal, there can be some success if there's concerted effort. I think this is true from some of the analysis of different studies that Lipsy's done. And so we want to be mindful of that going forward. And then I do want to, I'm going to skip this for now, but I do want to throw this question out there as we transition and basically just ask, and I think Christian has these questions and she can load them up in the chat, but one of the things I think that's worth just asking the group is what the biggest misconceptions or drawbacks about using evidence-based practices in juvenile justice. And so if you can put an answer in the chat, we'll kind of relay a couple of them before moving to the next step. Yeah, so implementation fidelity. Another one, what may work for many people may not work in individual circumstances. So the idea of kind of individual responsivity. Yeah, these come from people who do not understand what it's like to work the floor and how hard kids can be. So yeah, it's sort of that dichotomy between potentially research and practice. Yeah, they will work on all youth. So that's sort of that assumption. Specific populations, one size fits all. Yeah, very expensive to implement to fidelity. Yeah, so there's a lot. I mean, there's a lot here about sort of the both kind of individual sort of responsivity and individual applicability of potential practices, and then also the implementation. I think one thing that was really important to me as I was working on this, was to be pragmatic about this. And so, this requires careful consideration. I think to the point that was just made, it's important, it's really important that we understand going in. I think one of the things that, to me, I always keep in mind is that, in groups, when we're doing sessions like this, we have many people who are sort of interested in these topics and implementing and evaluating, promoting these practices. But one thing that was, pretty eye-opening to me when Peter Greenwood did a kind of a survey of some states that were, engaged in evidence-based practices, was just the degree to which it was very uneven, and it wasn't really a situation where a lot of youth were getting programming that would, we typically would think fits in that vein. And so, with that, I think the book is optimistic about what we can do. I think it tries to be, forward-looking in that way, but also wanted to be pragmatic and responsive. And for me, that also means kind of, as one of the answers said, the people who are working, in the front lines and day to day, making sure that we're at least mindful in laying out recommendations that we're considering some of the potential challenges. And so, the juvenile justice staff and individuals that I and others, including Derek, have met and interviewed over the years, making sure that kind of their perspective and maybe some of their healthy normal skepticism is at least accounted for in some ways. And so that really led to some work looking at implementation in developmental juvenile justice. And chapter 7 in the book is really all about implementation, and I think implementation in relation to juvenile justice. And I don't think the amount of time and space devoted to it in the book is enough. I actually think you could write a full book on that. But we do think that, and the reason I just posed the question I posed is that we do have this idealized view of evidence-based practice, that if we can just kind of get those practices in place, everything is going to be better. And I think that there's some reason we want to push, we want to do the best we can for youth who are involved in the juvenile justice system, and we want to promote positive development. We want to promote community safety, but we definitely also want to be mindful that these initiatives can be challenging and costly to implement well. And so, these initiatives that are developed really have to fit in the juvenile justice landscape reasonably well. This can be challenging since we are kind of facing a lot of variability in cases, variability in agencies and capacity. And so the idea is that we want to, we don't want to get into a pattern of just saying like, well, this is the way we've always done it, so let's just continue. But also, I do think we have to be very mindful of the initial conditions prior to implementation as well. And so fortunately, I think there's a growing body of research on real world cases that helps us to determine the feasibility of change and then also enhance the chances of success. And so that's the real focus of chapter 7 of the book. And I'm just going to go through a few things here and then hopefully have a couple minutes at the end to pose one more question to you and transition to next week. So I might skip a couple of slides as we go through. But I think one of the studies that I like to highlight that really points out the importance of implementation and fidelity is really this Derlock and Dupree study from 2008. And essentially what they did is did a large analysis, meta-analysis of a lot of interventions. It's not quite juvenile justice interventions, but a lot of them are the same kinds of things that we often would see or similar things that we would see in a juvenile justice context. Health promotion programs is what they referred to them. And what they did is they looked at both the main outcomes and then also the implementation quality. And most of the studies they found showed about 60% compliance. So, the implementation plan was there, and then it was about 60% compliant. And there were relatively few cases that were even above 80%. So again, indication, implementation is really hard and challenging. So again, that idea that maybe the easier part is developing the evidence does kind of hold here. And then effect sizes, so the effects for the well-implemented programs were much higher than those that were not. So this is really kind of putting the notion that while this is really challenging, it's worth at least trying to work on implementation and ensure that it's as strong as possible in a given instance. And so, basically what they conclude ultimately is that the implementation capacity, including funding and policy infrastructure, was really important and impactful. Skills and beliefs of the user, so the people who are at the front lines, and as was kind of mentioned in one of the responses to that question, those are essential in the process. And I'll kind of go through some work that highlights that even more in just a minute. But again, the idea is that this is a challenge, but it's probably worth trying to get right if we want to have programs that both do well sort of in initial settings, but then also can be transported into the field and into multiple places in the field. And so I won't go into this in too much detail, but basically the book, I think, lays out at one point in chapter 7, what I try to do is really convey how some of the things that are in the implementation science literature really play out in the juvenile justice system. And that's one of the things that's really central to that chapter. And I think down here, if we look at sort of individual adopter characteristics, this gets into the front line. And so one of the things when we start getting into youth development and trying to talk about a developmental juvenile justice system, well, then the views of youth development become important. And so we've seen that in some of the work on decisions with respect to transfer to the adult system, for example, the views of youth development become important, but then also that those views kind of get imported even for youth who are transferred. So while there's some evidence that there's some evidence that these views of youth development are fairly sticky in places where they're coming up, including to the extent that some prosecutors in some of Aaron Kupchik's work in New York and New Jersey really were, the language they were speaking was somewhat developmental in nature, and that was kind of an interesting finding, I thought, from his interviews. And so this idea of readiness for implementation is really important. And I think I won't go through all of this, but some of the things that the Backer talks about, and they were basically he and his colleagues worked a lot with the National Institutes of Drug Abuse in the 90s, and they were really talking about this idea of technology transfer, which is really just kind of moving research into practice, and really why some of those efforts were so challenging. And some of it was just the notion of the human dynamics at play. And so and I think some of the responses to that question that I just posed illustrate this well, which is that, if we're not attentive to that idea of readiness for change, both at the individual and organizational level, we can run into some real challenges, even with things that potentially should work. And it's important that we're mindful of that as we sort of partner and work with those in the field. And we want to be, partnering, I think is an important takeaway as well. I won't really dwell on this. These are core implementation drivers. Fixon and colleagues at the National Implementation Research Network at the University of North Carolina have a lot of useful information. This is a piece of this that I think will come up in our conversation next week. But one of the things that I do want to talk about is this idea of the practitioner as intervention. And this is something, again, that comes from Fixon and colleagues. And basically what they point out is that, in practices that involve human services and interaction, and certainly that's going to cover most facets of juvenile justice, the practitioner is actually the intervention. They're delivering a lot of that intervention. And so when we start to think about developmental juvenile justice, we really need to be mindful of that. And I think that that's a point, quite honestly, when we considered some of the works that I highlighted last week that really kind of drove a lot of the developmental science and kind of brought it into the courts and brought it into raise the age discussions, for example. I think that some of those points about how we implement this kind of in the juvenile justice system were not quite as front and center. And so I think when we're thinking about that, we really need to be considering, how every interaction needs to be developmental, and that's hard. And so we really need to be careful about that. And then I think the second point here is that in turn, leaving staff who are going to implement those policies, out of the planning, adoption, implementation, quality assurance, that's going to lead to ineffectiveness. So there needs to be integration, there needs to be inclusivity, in terms of planning and in terms of understanding how different practices might come into the field. And I think one of the things, again, sort of as I was working on this chapter of the book that was really striking to me is some work in public health by Green. And basically, that article really talked about the idea that there needs to be some practice-informed evidence as well. And so, to some extent, the questions that are being asked in research need to be responsive and reflective of what's happening in the field. And certainly, if we're thinking about developmentally, one of the things that can be valuable to know is sort of even just how different practitioners would define those terms, for example, and then how that should in turn frame our consideration of programming that might be more or less developmental. And then the last point that I will talk about, there's a few more slides at the end here that I don't think we will have time to get to, but I think the idea of balancing fidelity or adherence and adaptation is worth talking about. And that's something that came up again, I think, in some of the responses to the chats, is how do we know this will work in our environment? And certainly this comes up quite a bit, and when you talk about implementation research and the study I mentioned that we recently completed on risk and needs assessment in the juvenile justice system, this kind of point came up quite a bit. And so, the idea is that, for a long time, I think the notion was that if something is evidence-based, you basically take a checklist and then implement it as it was originally laid out. And this is this is kind of a blueprints type framework. But what's happening, or what has happened, is that sort of leaves personnel and agencies kind of at a loss in terms of thinking about, what strategies to adopt, what can be adopted. And I think that this last point here, what works in one place will not necessarily work in another. And so that's something that really needs to be borne in mind. And I think that your responses to that question illustrate it. And then also that idea of the one size fits all approach might dilute effectiveness. And so, one of the things that I think has been in implementation science that's really come to the fore is the more that people have studied these procedures for bringing effective policy and practice into the field, it's really been found that there does need to be some following of the key elements, but also there can be some flexibility to accommodate local circumstances. And so, that idea of being hard and fast fixed to a particular framework for implementation, we can sort of back off a little bit as long as we're being thoughtful about what's being changed and why, and also, as much as possible, monitoring that too. And so, I think when we start to talk about the research of it and trying to ensure that we can look at the same program across places and across populations, well, that's one need. But in terms of actually implementing effectively in particular places and in practice, as long as there's sort of well thought out adaptation, there's room for that. And I think that that's important when we start to talk about implementation practices, because I think one of the notions that people get kind of hung up on, and rightfully so, is that how do I know that this will work as well? Or I think my population is different in this way, and therefore we may need to make some tweaks to this approach. And I think what the later information and insight is saying is that there can be some reasonable, thoughtful adaptation, to better fit a setting. And certainly it's the lesser of two evils than maybe not adopting a potentially effective practice to begin with. So I won't go into this, but I will say there's 3 slides here that you can take a look at. One of the things that I think is important, just to say quickly, is we do assessments with youth when they come to particular points in the system. But in terms of doing feasibility assessments on ourselves, I missed an S. I missed an S there. But in terms of doing assessments on ourselves and determining how efficacious an approach is, how well it can be implemented. We're less keen on doing that, and I think it's really important that that become part of the regular process as we sort of try to implement different strategies from research, like some of the developmental strategies that I've talked about here. So I'll skip over this. And again, I think from the standpoint of limitations, there's going to be challenges and limitations in implementation. And so, we do need to move into the implementation phase with really open eyes and understand the evidence base, both in terms of, what is being implemented. So sort of the strategy and its efficacy, but then also, is there efficacy in the process we're using to implement that? And what we see now is that there's sort of these dual-pronged studies that really look both at, how well does this work, but also how well is the implementation happening too. And I think in terms of being open and mindful of this, we really can't be responsive to a particular challenge unless we're aware of it. And sometimes we sort of roll out and make suggestions that don't necessarily pan out, and we need to be careful of what challenges might come up as we implement those. But I would say also that progress can be made, despite that. And so I think, here I have this example of young adult dockets. Those are not exactly the same as expanding juvenile court jurisdiction to age 25, but they are a palatable way to remain developmentally informed. So I think that they're a good example of dealing with a possible implementation challenge and probably a political support challenge with some alternative approach, which might still be effective or can still be effective. All right, and I'll post this question maybe as we're signing off, and then perhaps we can answer that as I'm wrapping up, and then it will be there for next week. So Derek, I don't know if you want to post that question, and then I'll finish things off while we're doing that, maybe while we're getting a few responses that we can then incorporate into what we discuss next week. So this is the question, just basically kind of what do you think is the biggest challenge, biggest obstacle to implementing developmental practices in the juvenile justice system? And I think some of those might have come up a little bit in the previous answer, but if there are others, we can definitely fold those into what we discuss next time. So while Derek's putting that into the chat, again, I won't belabor this, but one of the things that we tried to do just this week is give you some of the ideas of what a more developmental approach might look like. I would argue that this is, and I think I'm clear on this in the book, that this is a blend of new ideas and research as well as some old. So one of the things that I think we need to be mindful of is that the system, to some extent, has always tried to be developmental in certain ways. And so, as intended, a lot of practices could be seen as developmental. Early judges or early probation officer supervisors really being close mentors of those who came before the court, youth who came before the court. That could be perceived as developmental in certain ways. In terms of being able to scale it up, that's a bigger challenge, of course. So, these calls for a more developmental approach is, I would argue, a blend of new ideas and then some old as well. But there's a variety of different stakeholders and challenges in implementation that we have to be mindful of. And with that, we need to both enhance the evidence base, I would argue, and then also be able to communicate it effectively. And I've tried to introduce you to some of the key pieces here in a general way. And just for those of you who are still on, just a preview of next week. We're going to blend these ideas more directly with the real world kind of juvenile justice policy and practice. And we're going to have a great panel of experts from across Utah's juvenile justice system. I had, as I mentioned, a pre-discussion with them about 10 days ago, and it was really fantastic. I think there's a lot of great ideas that will come through. And so if you have questions for that, we're going to basically use a lot of the questions that came up the last couple of weeks. But then if you have others that you'd like to send, you can certainly send them. You can either put them in the chat right now and or send them to Christian or Derek, and we'll integrate them as well as possible. And then if we don't get to them, we'll maybe set up a FAQ sheet, and I can work on creating or developing some answers to those as well. All right, so again, I won't hold those of you who are still on the line any longer, but I look forward to our discussion next week. Certainly, it will be it'll be great and interesting to tie some of these ideas and look at them in the context of what's happening in Utah and then what's happening in the juvenile justice system more broadly. And so hope certainly that you can join us. As I said, if you have questions or comments and you'd like to make sure that we incorporate or think about them for next week, we will. That will be the entirety of the session. We'll have this panel and kind of focus on that so that we can talk through some of these ideas in a bit more grounded way. But otherwise, thank you for coming and joining us today. And I will see you next week.